History does not feel distant, it feels interrupted. Inside mountains and under layers of cities built over themselves, there are things that do not align with the progression we assume we understand. Precision appears without any traceable process. Massive stones are placed with near-zero tolerance, yet no clear method survives. Some structures show repetition not as experimentation, but as if a standard already existed. The issue is not that these things exist. The issue is how they exist detached from the steps that should have produced them. What remains does not tell a story. It only preserves outcomes. And when only the outcomes remain, every explanation about the process becomes uncertain. El Fuerte de Samaipata is not a fortress in any conventional sense, but a massive sandstone ridge that has been deliberately carved, reshaped, and modified across its entire surface, creating one of the largest rock-carved sites in the world. Stretching approximately 220 meters in length, the formation is covered with channels, niches, geometric cuts, and flattened platforms, none of which correspond to defensive architecture or residential use. The site does not function as a place of protection or habitation. Instead, it represents a landscape that was intentionally transformed, raising a central problem that remains unresolved. What purpose required altering an entire natural hill at this scale? Located in Bolivia at the eastern foothills of the Andes, the site occupies a strategic transition zone between highland and lowland environments, an area historically associated with cultural exchange. Archaeological evidence shows that Samaipata developed over multiple phases rather than a single construction period. The earliest occupation is linked to the Shimao, an Arawak-speaking group present before the 15th century, while later additions are associated with the expansion of the Inca Empire into the region. This sequence is supported by material findings such as ceramics and nearby architectural remains, particularly structures consistent with Inca design. The site was officially recognized for its significance in 1998 when UNESCO designated it a World Heritage Site, emphasizing both its scale and its multi-layered cultural history. The carved surface itself is the defining feature and the primary source of uncertainty. Across the ridge runs a network of linear channels that intersect and extend across uneven terrain, some shallow and others deeply incised into the sandstone. Rectangular and trapezoidal niches have been cut into vertical sections, while leveled platforms and stepped forms suggest deliberate modification of the natural topography. Among these carvings are figures interpreted as zoomorphic shapes, most commonly associated with felines such as jaguars, animals that held symbolic importance across many South American cultures. These elements are not randomly distributed. Their repetition and alignment indicate planning and continuity, yet they do not correspond to any known functional layout such as housing, storage, or fortification. Archaeological surveys confirm the absence of domestic features on the carved ridge, reinforcing the conclusion that its purpose was neither residential nor defensive. Attempts to explain the function of Samaipata have produced several competing interpretations, none of which fully account for all available evidence. One of the most widely accepted views is that the site served as a ceremonial or ritual center. The carved channels are often cited as evidence, potentially used to direct liquids such as water during ritual activities, a practice consistent with broader Andean traditions where landscape modification and water management held symbolic meaning. However, there is no direct physical evidence, such as residue analysis or associated artifacts, that conclusively demonstrates ritual use at this scale. Another interpretation considers the possibility of astronomical significance, with some researchers examining the orientation of certain carvings for alignments with solar or seasonal cycles. While a number of features appear suggestive, systematic studies have not produced consistent or reproducible results sufficient to establish the site as an observatory. A third interpretation frames Samaipata as a symbolic or political landscape, where authority was expressed through the transformation of the environment itself. The scale of labor required implies coordination and control, yet without inscriptions or administrative remains, the nature of that authority remains undefined. From a technical standpoint, the material used does not fully explain the achievement. Sandstone is relatively soft compared to harder rocks such as granite, making it workable with tools available to pre-Columbian societies, including stone implements and later metal tools used by the Inca. Experimental studies have shown that carving sandstone is feasible using repeated abrasion and impact. The challenge lies in the scale and coherence of the work rather than the material itself. The channels extend across long distances while maintaining continuity, and the carved features display a level of consistency that suggests sustained planning rather than isolated acts. This implies a long-term process, possibly extending across generations, although no definitive construction sequence has been established. Attribution remains one of the most unresolved aspects of the site. While the presence of the Shanay and later Inca occupation is well supported by archaeological evidence, determining which group was responsible for the primary carvings is far less certain. The Inca are known for incorporating and adapting existing sacred landscapes, which raises the possibility that the carved ridge predates their arrival and was later modified or reinterpreted. However, there is no definitive evidence that assigns the original transformation of the rock to a specific culture. This lack of attribution creates a discontinuity between the most prominent feature of the site and the cultural framework used to interpret it. Further complicating analysis is the condition of the rock itself. Sandstone is highly susceptible to erosion, and over centuries, natural weathering has softened edges, removed finer details, and altered original forms. Prior to modern conservation efforts, human activity also contributed to damage. As a result, parts of the site's original configuration are no longer recoverable. This loss of detail limits interpretation, as features that may have clarified function or sequence have been partially or completely erased. The absence of evidence in such cases cannot be taken as evidence of absence, leaving key questions unresolved. Within the broader context of Andean archaeology, Samaipata occupies a unique position. Other known ceremonial carved into a sheer cliff along the Mutkvari River, the Vardzia cave monastery complex does not present itself as architecture in the conventional sense. From a distance, it disappears into the rock face. Only at close range does the illusion break, revealing hundreds of openings, layered vertically, extending deep into the mountain. What appears today as a vast exposed network was not designed to be visible. Historical evidence indicates that much of the facade was once concealed by the natural outer layer of the cliff, effectively masking the complex from view. The contradiction is immediate. A construction of immense scale, deliberately hidden. The current appearance of Vardzia is the result of a rupture, not an intention. In the year 1283, a major earthquake struck the region, collapsing significant portions of the outer rock layer. This event exposed the internal structure, transforming what had been a concealed system into an open facade. Archaeological and geological assessments confirm that large sections of the cliff sheared away, revealing chambers, corridors, and terraces that were previously internal. The implication is critical. The visible complexity of Vardzia today represents only a partial reconstruction of its original form. The structure we study is, in effect, a cross-section of something that was once enclosed. Vardzia was constructed in the 12th century during the reign of George III of Georgia, and significantly expanded under his successor, Queen Tamar, one of the most influential rulers of the medieval kingdom of Georgia. This period is widely recognized as a political and cultural apex, marked by territorial expansion and increasing military pressure from neighboring powers. Contemporary chronicles and later historical analyses consistently identify Vardzia as both a monastic center and a fortified refuge. This dual classification is not speculative. It is supported by the integration of defensive features alongside religious infrastructure. IV. Scale and internal organization. A system beyond monastic needs. Estimates based on archaeological surveys indicate that Vardzia originally contained up to 13 levels and more than 6,000 individual spaces, including living quarters, storage rooms, chapels, and passageways. Even accounting for collapse and erosion, several hundred rooms remain accessible today. The layout is not random. Spatial organization reflects functional zoning. Residential clusters, communal areas, and religious spaces are distributed in a way that implies centralized planning. At the core lies the Church of the Dormition, whose preserved frescoes date to the late 12th century. These paintings include identifiable depictions of Queen Tamar and George III of Georgia, providing firm chronological anchors. Yet the presence of a central church does not resolve the larger inconsistency. Monasteries of the same period do not require thousands of rooms or multi-level subterranean expansion. The scale aligns more closely with temporary habitation on a mass level than with isolated religious life. Unlike masonry-based construction, Vardzia was created through excavation. Spaces were carved directly into volcanic tuff, a relatively soft but structurally stable rock. This subtractive method demands a different kind of precision. Instead of assembling materials, builders had to remove them while preserving load-bearing integrity. Errors could not be corrected by replacement. A miscalculation could compromise entire sections. Comparisons are often drawn to Petra, another rock-cut site. However, Petra's monumental facades are primarily surface-oriented, whereas Vardzia extends inward and upward in a layered network. The engineering challenge is therefore not only aesthetic but spatial, maintaining stability across multiple interconnected levels. No detailed construction records survive to explain how labor was organized, how excavation sequences were planned, or how structural failures were mitigated during the process. One of the most critical components of Vardzia is its internal water system. Channels were cut to bring fresh water from external sources into the complex, distributing it across multiple levels. The existence of this system is archaeologically confirmed through surviving conduits and flow paths. Its function extends beyond convenience. In a siege scenario, access to water determines survival duration. The integration of water infrastructure within the carved environment indicates foresight in sustaining a large enclosed population. The engineering constraints are non-trivial. Gravity-fed systems require precise gradient control, particularly in a vertical, multi-tiered structure. The successful implementation suggests an advanced, practical understanding of fluid behavior, even in the absence of formalized hydraulic theory. The defensive characteristics of Vardzia are embedded in its geometry. Narrow privage points, interconnected tunnels, and layered access routes create a controlled internal environment. Movement can be restricted, redirected, or concealed. When combined with its original concealed facade, the complex functions less like an open settlement and more like a fortified interior. Historical context reinforces this interpretation. The 12th and 13th centuries in the region were marked by external threats, including incursions that required rapid defensive responses. Vardzia's capacity to house large numbers of people, combined with its concealed position and internal resources, aligns with the concept of a refuge designed for temporary occupation under threat conditions. This is not an inferred narrative. It is consistent with both structural evidence and historical necessity. Despite extensive study, several aspects of Vardzia remain unresolved, not due to speculation but due to absence of data. First, the full extent of the original structure cannot be reconstructed with certainty. The 1,283 earthquake removed unknown volumes of material, and no pre-collapse records exist to define the original facade. Second, the logistics of construction remain unclear. While labor estimates can be proposed based on volume removal, there is no documentation detailing workforce size, construction phases, or timelines beyond broad historical attribution. Third, The balance between religious and military function is not definitively quantified. While both roles are supported by evidence, the primary driver behind the scale of the complex is still debated within academic literature. These are not gaps created by mystery for its own sake. They are the natural limits of surviving evidence. Vardzia resists simple classification. It is neither purely a monastery nor solely a fortress. It is a hybrid system, carved into a mountain during a period of political strength and external threat, designed to sustain, conceal, and protect. The earthquake that revealed it did not create its complexity, it only exposed it. What remains is a structure whose visible form is incomplete, whose internal logic is partially understood, and whose original appearance is permanently lost. The significance of Vardzia lies not in what is unknown, but in what can be confirmed. A large-scale, multifunctional environment engineered within solid rock, operating at a level of coordination and foresight that exceeds the expectations typically assigned to its category. A structure does not need massive walls or towering monuments to reshape how power is understood. Along a tributary of the Euphrates in southeastern Anatolia, a relatively modest site carved into limestone preserves one of the clearest and most deliberate statements of royal identity from the Hellenistic world. Arsameia on the Nymphaios was not a capital, not a major urban centre, and shows little evidence of dense habitation. Yet within its rock-cut chambers, inscriptions, and reliefs lies a carefully constructed system of belief that connects kingship, divinity, and memory in ways that remain only partially understood. The site belonged to the small but strategically positioned kingdom of Commagene, which flourished in the 1st century BCE at the crossroads of Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Its most prominent ruler, Antiochus I, Theos of Commagene, reigned from approximately 70 to 38 BCE and is widely known for constructing the monumental sanctuary at Nemrut Dar. However, long before visitors ascend that mountain of colossal statues, Arsameia presents a quieter but equally deliberate expression of the same ideology. Archaeological surveys, particularly those led in the 20th century by German researchers such as Friedrich Karl Dörner, have documented the site's key features: a series of rock-cut passages, a monumental Greek inscription extending over 100 lines, and reliefs that visually encode the king's claimed divine lineage. Among these, the most striking is a carved relief depicting Antiochus in a formal handshake with Heracles. This image is not symbolic in a casual sense. It reflects a specific and documented tradition in Commagene royal ideology. Antiochus claimed descent from both Persian and Macedonian ancestors, linking himself to the Achaemenid royal line on one side and to Alexander the Great's successors on the other. Inscriptions found at Arsameia and Nemrut explicitly outline this genealogy, presenting it as a matter of political legitimacy rather than mythological embellishment. The handshake, therefore, functions as a visual contract, an assertion that the king stands not beneath the gods, but in direct continuity with them. Similar iconography appears across the region, but here it is embedded within a site that lacks the scale typically associated with such declarations, raising a critical question. Why place such a significant ideological statement in a relatively isolated location? The answer begins to emerge in the long Greek inscription carved into the rock face at Arsameia. Unlike short dedicatory texts common in many ancient sites, this inscription spans roughly 150 lines and records detailed instructions regarding ritual practices, royal commemoration, and the maintenance of cult activities. It describes ceremonies intended to honor the king and his ancestors, specifying offerings, processions, and the roles of participants. The language is Greek, reflecting the administrative and cultural influence of the Hellenistic world, yet the content incorporates concepts rooted in Iranian religious tradition, particularly the emphasis on royal ancestors and posthumous veneration. This fusion is not speculative. It is directly observable in the terminology and structure of the text, which has been studied and translated by multiple scholars. What emerges is a hybrid system in which political authority is reinforced through ritual continuity. ensuring that the king's presence extends beyond his lifetime. If the inscription defines the ideological framework, the underground passage at Arsameia introduces its most enigmatic element. Carved directly into the bedrock, the passage descends steeply for approximately 150 meters through a narrow, carefully cut corridor. The engineering is precise but austere. No decorative elements, no obvious chambers for storage or habitation, and no defensive features that would suggest a military function. Its dimensions make movement difficult, particularly in the lower sections, and the absence of everyday artifacts complicates interpretation. Excavations have not yielded clear evidence of regular use, yet the effort required to create such a structure is undeniable. Scholars have proposed that the passage served a ritual purpose, possibly connected to symbolic journeys into the underworld or to ceremonies involving controlled access to sacred space. This interpretation aligns with broader patterns in ancient Near Eastern religions, where descent into the earth often represented contact with ancestral or chthonic powers. However, no definitive proof confirms this function, leaving the passage as one of the site's most persistent uncertainties. What distinguishes Arsameia is not the presence of unknowns alone, but the contrast between what is clearly documented and what remains unresolved. The reliefs, inscriptions, and historical context all point toward a site dedicated to the cultivation of royal identity through ritual and narrative. At the same time, the physical layout, particularly the underground corridor, introduces elements that resist straightforward explanation. Unlike large urban centres, where function can often be inferred from scale and infrastructure, Arsameia operates on a different logic. It does not need to accommodate thousands of inhabitants or facilitate trade. Instead, it concentrates its resources on a limited set of features, each carrying symbolic weight. This distinction becomes clearer when compared to Nemrut Da. At Nemrut, the monumental statues and tumulus create an overwhelming visual statement, projecting power across the landscape. Arsameia, by contrast, is inward-facing. Its messages are carved into rock, its passages hidden below the surface, and its inscriptions require close engagement to be understood. The two sites are not redundant. They represent complementary aspects of the same system. One communicates through scale and visibility, the other through text, ritual, and controlled access. Together, they form a network of meaning that extends beyond any single location. The broader implication is that Commogene's rulers were not merely constructing monuments. They were designing an integrated framework for how power would be perceived, remembered, and legitimized. Arsameia's role within this framework appears to be highly specialized. It is not a place for public display in the conventional sense, but a setting where ideology is formalized and preserved. The inscription ensures that specific practices are recorded and repeated, while the reliefs anchor those practices in a visual narrative of divine connection. The underground passage, whether fully understood or not, reinforces the sense that participation in this system required movement, both physical and symbolic, into spaces set apart from ordinary life. Despite decades of research, certain aspects of the site remain open to interpretation. The exact function of the subterranean corridor, the frequency and scale of rituals conducted there, and the extent to which Arsameia was accessible to the broader population are all subjects of ongoing study. What is clear, however, is that the site was intentionally designed to operate beyond the logic of everyday settlement. Its significance lies not in what it produced or stored, but in what it encoded, a carefully structured vision of kingship that blends Greek language, Persian heritage, and local tradition into a unified system. Inside a sealed volcanic cave on the island of Gran Canaria, light behaves with precision that contradicts the simplicity of its surroundings. There are no large openings, no monumental architecture, no visible instruments, yet at specific moments of the year, a narrow beam of sunlight enters through a small aperture in the ceiling and projects a moving shape across the interior wall. The movement is not random, it follows a repeatable path, aligned with the seasonal cycle of the Sunday. This is not an isolated occurrence. It is a controlled phenomenon embedded within the structure itself. The question is not whether the light appears, the question is why it was designed to do so. Risco Caído forms part of a wider archaeological landscape officially recognized by UNESCO in 2019 as the Risco Caído and the Sacred Mountains of Gran Canaria cultural landscape. The site preserves evidence of the Perond, island's pre-Hispanic inhabitants, a population of North African Berber origin that settled the Canary Islands more than a millennium before European contact. Archaeological data places the occupation of these caves roughly between the 6th and 15th centuries CE, based on material remains, stratigraphy, and radiocarbon dating from associated sites across the island. Unlike monumental stone cities found elsewhere, this landscape is defined by adaptation rather than scale. Hundreds of caves, some natural, others excavated, were used as dwellings, storage spaces, and ritual chambers. Among them, one structure stands apart not for its size, but for its internal design. Cave 6. Cave 6 is not architecturally complex in conventional terms. It consists of a circular chamber carved into soft volcanic tuff, with a domed ceiling and smooth interior walls. At the top of the dome, a small, carefully positioned opening allows sunlight to enter under specific conditions. The geometry is deliberate. The aperture is neither wide nor randomly placed. Its alignment ensures that light penetrates the chamber only when the sun reaches certain irtifayas in the sky. Field observations and documented studies by archaeologists and archaeoastronomers have confirmed that during key moments of the solar year, particularly around the equinoxes, the incoming light forms a defined beam that travels across the wall in a predictable trajectory. Over the course of a single day, the illuminated shape shifts position, tracing a path that changes with the season. This is not a passive opening. It is an active interface between architecture and celestial motion. The behavior of light inside Cave 6 has been recorded through direct observation, photography, and time-based analysis. During equinox periods, the beam enters at an angle that produces a triangular or elongated shape, which gradually moves along the curved wall. As the year progresses towards solstices, both the angle and duration of illumination change. Researchers have proposed that this system functioned as a solar marker, a method of tracking seasonal transitions essential for agricultural timing. In many early societies, the ability to anticipate planting and harvesting cycles depended on observing the sun's position. The consistency of the light pattern in Cave 6 suggests long-term observation and calibration. However, no written records from the pre-Hispanic inhabitants of Gran Canaria survive to confirm this interpretation. The site offers evidence of function through behavior, not through text. The pattern is measurable. The intention remains inferred. What distinguishes Cave 6 from other solar-aligned structures is not only the presence of light, but where that light falls. The interior walls of the chamber contain engraved motifs, most notably a series of triangular shapes widely interpreted in archaeology as representations of the female pubic form, a symbol associated with fertility across multiple prehistoric cultures. During illumination events, the projected light interacts directly with these engravings. The beam does not strike an empty surface, it activates a space already marked with symbolic meaning. This spatial relationship between solar movement and fertility imagery has led researchers to suggest that the cave may have served a ritual function connected to cycles of life, reproduction, or seasonal renewal. Yet this remains an interpretation grounded in comparative anthropology rather than direct evidence. The engravings are real, the light interaction is real, the cultural meaning behind their combination is still under investigation. The construction of Cave 6 implies a level of environmental knowledge that extends beyond basic shelter making. To produce a repeatable light effect tied to solar movement, its creators needed to understand the changing position of the sun across the year. This does not require advanced tools, but it does require sustained observation over long periods. Similar principles are found in sites such as Newgrange in Ireland, where sunlight enters a burial chamber only during the winter solstice, or Checo Canyon in North America, where structures align with solar and lunar cycles. In each case, the underlying mechanism is consistent, repeated observation translated into built form. Risco Caído fits within this broader pattern, but differs in scale and context. A system of massive stone terraces rises in layers along a windswept ridge in northern China, forming one of the most structurally complex landscapes of the late Neolithic period. At first glance, these stepped platforms appear to be simple adaptations to uneven terrain, but excavation has shown that they were not passive responses to geography. They were deliberately engineered, reinforced, and integrated into a much larger urban system, one that challenges conventional assumptions about early Chinese civilization. Known today as Shimao, this site, dated to approximately 2300 to 1800 BCE, is currently recognized as the largest known stone-built settlement from prehistoric China, covering roughly 400 hectares. And at the edge of its core, the outer terraces reveal a problem that archaeology has yet to fully resolve. The terraces were constructed by cutting into slopes and building up artificial platforms supported by stone retaining walls. These were not loosely arranged surfaces, they were systematically organized into multiple levels, connected by pathways and bounded by structural reinforcements. In several areas, excavations have uncovered traces of buildings on top of these platforms, suggesting that they served as active zones of occupation or activity, rather than unused margins. This alone complicates the simplest explanation that terraces existed only to stabilize the hillside. Their scale and regularity imply planning. Their integration into the city's defensive walls implies purpose. That defensive interpretation is, at first, the most intuitive. Shimao was surrounded by extensive fortifications, including massive stone walls, gates, and towers. The terraces, arranged in ascending tiers, would have forced any approaching force to navigate multiple elevation changes before reaching the inner core. This layered defense system would slow movement, expose attackers, and provide strategic advantage to those positioned above. Yet the structure exceeds what is strictly necessary for military defense. The number of terraces, their breadth, and their distribution across the site suggest that they were not designed solely as barriers. If defense were the only goal, simpler and more direct fortifications would have sufficed. A second explanation emerges from spatial organization. The central part of Shimao, located at the highest elevation, contains the most monumental structures, including what appears to be a palace complex. Surrounding this elevated core, the terraces form transitional zones between the elite center and the outer periphery. This pattern reflects a vertical hierarchy, where elevation corresponds to social or political status. Such an arrangement is consistent with later urban traditions in which power is physically elevated above the general population. However, what makes Shimao unusual is how early this pattern appears. At a time when most settlements in the region relied on rammed earth and relatively simple layouts, Shimao exhibits a level of spatial control that suggests an already developed system of authority and planning. Evidence from the site reinforces the idea that these terraces were embedded in more than just practical design. Excavations have revealed human skulls embedded within parts of the city's defensive walls, interpreted by archaeologists as signs of ritual activity, possibly related to foundation ceremonies or displays of power. While these findings are concentrated near key architectural features, they indicate that construction at Shimao was not purely functional, it was also symbolic. Within this context, the terraces may have played a role in structuring movement, visibility, and access elements that are critical not only for defense but for the performance of authority. There is also a logistical dimension to consider. Building a city on uneven terrain presents constraints that cannot be ignored. Terracing creates usable flat surfaces, reduces erosion, and allows for the controlled expansion of infrastructure. In this sense, the outer terraces of Shimao may represent an early form of large-scale landscape engineering. But again, the scale introduces a contradiction. The amount of labour required to construct and maintain these platforms is significant. The decision to use stone rather than the more common rammed earth further increases that cost. This suggests that efficiency alone was not the guiding principle. Instead, the terraces appear to balance practicality with intent, combining environmental adaptation with architectural expression. Comparative analysis strengthens this observation. Contemporary Neolithic sites in northern China, such as those associated with the Longshan culture, generally lack the extensive use of stone and the multi-tiered layout seen at Shimao. Their structures are typically lower, more uniform, and less integrated with surrounding topography. Shimao stands apart not just in size, but in the complexity of its construction. The terraces in particular represent a level of coordination that implies centralized control over labor and resources. This is not a scattered village expanding organically. It is a designed system executed with consistency across a large area. What remains unresolved is the primary function that drove this design. Each explanation defense, social hierarchy, ritual significance, environmental adaptation accounts for part of the evidence, but none fully explains the whole. The terraces operate at the intersection of these roles, making it difficult to isolate a single purpose. This ambiguity is not due to a lack of data, but to the nature of the structure itself. It was likely intended to serve multiple functions simultaneously, creating a built environment that could support, display, and reinforce the organization of the society that constructed it. In the absence of written records, interpretation relies on patterns, and the pattern at Shimao is clear in one respect. The outer terraces are not incidental. They are foundational. They shape how the city expands, how it is defended, how it is experienced, and possibly how power is expressed within it. More than 4,000 years after their construction, they remain physically intact enough to demonstrate that the people who built them understood not only how to manipulate stone and terrain, but how to integrate those elements into a coherent system. The question that follows is not whether the terraces had a purpose, but whether that purpose has been fully recognized. If a prehistoric society invested this level of effort into shaping its landscape in layers, each one structured, reinforced, and connected, then the terraces are not just architectural features. They are evidence of a model of organization that predates many of the systems we associate with early civilization. And until that model is clearly understood, the outer terraces of Shimao remain less a solved structure than an ongoing problem, one built in stone, and still resisting a single explanation. A single mound rises quietly along the northern coast of Bahrain, unremarkable at first glance, but beneath its surface lies a continuous record of human occupation spanning more than 4,000 years. This is not a ruin in the conventional sense. It is a structure built, abandoned, and rebuilt repeatedly layer upon layer by entirely different civilizations that had no direct continuity, yet chose the exact same ground. Archaeologists identify this formation as a tell, a man-made hill created through accumulated habitation debris reaching a depth of approximately 7 to 12 meters. The anomaly is not that people lived here. The anomaly is that they kept returning to this precise location across millennia under changing cultural and political systems without any single explanation that fully accounts for its persistence. Systematic excavations began in the 1950s, led initially by Danish archaeologists, followed by extensive French missions that continued uncovering the site's complexity. What emerged was not a single settlement, but a sequence of at least 7 major cultural phases. Each layer revealed distinct architectural styles, construction materials, and urban layouts, indicating successive occupations rather than continuous cultural evolution. Houses, defensive walls, temples, and storage facilities appeared in different strata, often separated by clear destruction or abandonment horizons. Unlike sites dependent on written archives, Qal'at al-Bahrain provides a rare form of evidence, a physical timeline embedded in the Qal'at itself. Stratigraphy, the study of layered deposits, confirms that occupation at the site began around the early 2nd millennium BCE, with some evidence extending back toward the late 3rd millennium BCE, and continued intermittently until the 16th century CE. The continuity is not cultural, but spatial. Different societies, separated by centuries, independently chose to build on the same foundation. The earliest major phase of the site is associated with the civilization of Dilmun, a name preserved in cuneiform texts from Mesopotamia. These records describe Dilmun as a prosperous and strategically positioned region, often characterized as a hub of maritime trade. Archaeological findings at Qal'at al-Bahrain support this description. Imported pottery, standardized seals, and administrative artifacts point to sustained interaction with both Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. However, the structure of Dilmun itself remains unclear. There are no surviving internal texts that define its political organization, leadership, or administrative system. Everything known about it is inferred indirectly from trade goods, external references, and material distribution. This creates a fundamental gap. Qal'at al-Bahrain is widely interpreted as the capital or central settlement of Dilmun, yet the nature of its authority is still debated. Was it a centralized state or a networked trade hub with distributed power? The archaeological record confirms its importance, but not the mechanism behind it. The architectural techniques found at the site are not technologically extraordinary. Structures were primarily built using locally available limestone and mud brick, materials typical of the region. Walls were thick, foundations practical, and layouts adapted to environmental conditions. There is no evidence of advanced engineering beyond the expected capabilities of ancient Near Eastern societies, yet the significance lies elsewhere. Over thousands of years, the same location was repeatedly reoccupied and rebuilt, often directly atop earlier foundations. This implies a consistent recognition of the site's value, whether economic, strategic, or environmental, across entirely different cultural contexts. Maintaining urban relevance over such a duration requires more than technical skill. It requires a stable set of underlying advantages that persist even as political systems collapse and reform. The question is not how the buildings were constructed, but why this exact location remained viable for so long. Archaeological layers indicate that the site was not continuously inhabited without interruption. Several phases show evidence of decline or complete abandonment, followed by later reoccupation. These transitions are marked by shifts in material culture, construction style, and settlement density. Scholars propose multiple explanations: fluctuations in regional trade routes, environmental changes affecting water availability, or shifts in political control across the Gulf region. However, no single theory accounts for all observed transitions. More importantly, none fully explains the repeated return to the same location after periods of decline. If the site lost its strategic value, why was it later rediscovered and reused? The pattern suggests that whatever made the location significant was not permanently diminished even when temporarily abandoned. Geographical evidence indicates that Qal'at al-Bahrain was closely connected to an ancient harbour system, positioning it along key maritime routes in the Persian Gulf. This aligns with its role in long-distance trade networks linking Mesopotamia and the Indus region. Coastal sediment analysis and archaeological remains suggest that the shoreline in antiquity was closer to the site than it is today, reinforcing its function as a port settlement. However, the full scale and organization of this harbour remain uncertain. there is no complete reconstruction of its infrastructure, capacity, or administrative control. The available evidence confirms maritime activity, but not its exact magnitude. This leaves an open question. Was Qal'at al-Bahrain simply one node among many, or was it a dominant control point within a larger economic system? Few archaeological sites offer such a clear vertical record of human activity. Each layer at Qal'at al-Bahrain represents a distinct phase of occupation, allowing researchers to trace changes in architecture, economy, and external influence over time. Unlike fragmented sites where evidence is scattered, this location compresses centuries into a single, readable sequence. This makes it possible to observe patterns that are otherwise difficult to detect. Cycles of growth and decline, shifts in trade connections, and transformations in urban planning. Yet even with this level of clarity, the core pattern remains unresolved. The continuity of place contrasts sharply with the discontinuity of culture. Human history is often presented as a sequence, one species replacing another, one chapter closing before the next begins. But along the southern edge of Greece, in a quiet limestone cave overlooking the sea, that sequence begins to fracture. The evidence found inside Kalamakia cave does not suggest a clean transition from Neanderthals to modern humans. Instead, it points to something less orderly, less predictable, a population that may have persisted longer than expected, occupying a landscape that should, by conventional timelines, already have belonged to someone else. The question is not whether Neanderthals lived here. The evidence confirms that they did. The problem is when they left, and whether that moment came later than we think. Systematic excavations at Kalamakia began in the late 20th century, led by Greek archaeologists investigating the prehistoric occupation of the Mani Peninsula. What initially appeared to be another coastal cave soon revealed a far more significant record. Within its stratified deposits, researchers uncovered a sequence of archaeological layers containing stone tools, animal remains, and crucially, human fossils attributed to Neanderthals. Among the most important finds were teeth, cranial fragments, and postcranial bones, all consistent with Neanderthal morphology. These discoveries placed Kalamakia firmly within the network of known Neanderthal sites across Europe. Yet, unlike many inland sites, Kalamakia offered a coastal context, an environment that may have supported different survival strategies. The cave was not a temporary shelter used once and abandoned. The repeated accumulation of material across multiple layers indicated something more stable, a place revisited, reused, and integrated into a long-term pattern of habitation. 3. Stratigraphy. Evidence written in layers. The structure of the cave's deposits is central to its significance. Kalamakia preserves a stratified record extending through the late Pleistocene, with archaeological layers corresponding to different phases of occupation. Each layer contains variations in tool assemblages and faunal remains, suggesting changes in behavior or environment over time. The stone tools recovered from these layers are characteristic of the Mousterian industry, a technology closely associated with Neanderthals across Europe and Western Asia. These tools, scrapers, points, and flakes, were produced using prepared core techniques, demonstrating a controlled and repeatable method of manufacture. Their presence across multiple layers indicates continuity rather than abrupt change. Faunal remains found alongside the tools include species such as deer and caprids, showing that the inhabitants relied on terrestrial hunting. Cut marks on bones confirm butchering practices using stone tools. The consistency of these findings across stratigraphic levels reinforces a key conclusion. Kalamakia was not an isolated episode of occupation, but part of a sustained pattern extending over tens of thousands of years. Determining the precise age of Kalamakia's layers has proven complex. Researchers have relied on a combination of stratigraphic analysis and radiometric methods, including uranium series dating and electron spin resonance (ESR), to establish a chronological framework. These methods suggest that the cave was occupied by Neanderthals from approximately 100,000 years ago to around 40,000 years ago. This upper boundary is where the uncertainty becomes significant. Around 40,000 years ago is also the period during which Homo sapiens had already expanded into much of Europe. If the later layers at Kalamakia indeed correspond to this time frame, then the site may represent a period of overlap, however brief, between the two species in southern Greece. It is important to emphasize that this interpretation remains cautious. The dating of late Pleistocene sites often carries margins of error, and the exact timing of Neanderthal disappearance varies across regions. Kalamakia does not provide definitive proof of direct interaction between Neanderthals and modern humans. What it does provide is evidence that the boundary between them may not have been as sharp or simultaneous as once assumed. Kalamakia's coastal location introduces another dimension to its interpretation. Unlike many Neanderthal sites situated deep inland, this cave overlooks the Mediterranean, offering access to a diverse ecological zone. While the majority of faunal remains point to terrestrial hunting, the proximity to the sea raises the possibility of broader resource use. Even without definitive evidence of systematic marine exploitation, the environment itself would have provided advantages: stable climate conditions, varied food sources, and a landscape less affected by the extreme glaciation seen in northern regions. The Mani Peninsula, with its relative isolation and ecological diversity, may have functioned as a refugium, a place where populations could persist while conditions elsewhere became less favourable. This possibility aligns with in the northern interior of modern Tunisia, within what was once the Roman province of Africa Proconsularis, the ruins of Bulla Regia present a contradiction that does not resolve easily. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, this was not a marginal settlement. It was a prosperous urban centre integrated into the Roman world, equipped with forums, baths, and elite residences. Yet the most distinctive structures here do not rise above the ground like the villas of Pompeii or Herculaneum. They descend beneath it. Excavations carried out from the 19th century onward revealed a pattern repeated across multiple elite houses. Beneath the visible remains lies a second level fully constructed, carefully decorated, and evidently intended for daily life. These are not cellars or storage spaces. They are complete residential environments built underground, known in Roman terminology as hypogea. The archaeological record leaves little ambiguity about their function. Subterranean rooms at Bulla Regia include bedrooms, dining spaces, corridors, and central courtyards open to the sky. Many are adorned with mosaics of a quality comparable to other high-status Roman sites across North Africa. Floors depict geometric designs, mythological figures, and symbolic motifs, executed with precision using locally available stone tesserae. The level of investment is unmistakable. This was not an improvised solution. It was planned architecture, and it raises a direct question. Why would a Roman elite, known for expressing status through visibility, choose to place their most refined living spaces below ground? The most widely accepted explanation begins with climate. Northern Tunisia experiences long, dry summers, where daytime temperatures can exceed 40 degrees Celsius. In such conditions, thermal stability becomes a decisive factor in comfort. Subterranean spaces, insulated by surrounding earth, maintain significantly lower and more stable temperatures than structures exposed to direct solar radiation. This principle is well understood today as passive cooling, and it requires no mechanical intervention. Thick walls, reduced exposure, and controlled ventilation together create a naturally regulated interior climate. The houses of Bulla Regia demonstrate this logic with clarity. Their lower levels remain cool even in extreme heat, suggesting that environmental adaptation played a central role in their design. However, the climate-based explanation, while necessary, is not sufficient. Roman architecture elsewhere faced similar environmental pressures without adopting this specific solution at scale. In cities such as Carthage or Leptis Magna, also located in hot regions of North Africa, elite houses relied on surface-level strategies, shaded atria, water features, and thick masonry walls. These methods were effective and widely used across the empire. What distinguishes Bulla Regia is not simply that it addressed heat, but that it did so by reorganizing the spatial hierarchy of the house. The underground level is not secondary. In many cases, it appears to be the primary living space, while the upper level serves a more limited or seasonal role. This inversion of architectural priority is not a standard Roman response. Engineering details reinforce this interpretation. The subterranean villas are not enclosed cavities, but carefully structured environments. Central courtyards allow natural light to penetrate downward, while openings and corridors facilitate air circulation. The arrangement suggests an understanding, whether empirical or intuitive, of airflow dynamics and heat distribution. There is no surviving technical documentation describing these systems, yet their effectiveness is evident in the physical remains. The design achieves environmental control without mechanical complexity, relying instead on geometry, orientation, and material properties. In this sense, the technology is simple, but its application is highly optimized. Another factor complicates the picture further: preservation. Because these living spaces were built below ground level, they have survived in significantly better condition than the structures above them. Exposure to weather, erosion, and human activity has degraded most surface architecture at the site. In contrast, the underground rooms retain mosaics, wall structures, and spatial layouts with remarkable clarity. This creates a form of archaeological bias. What we see most clearly today are the buried spaces, which may amplify their perceived importance. Yet even accounting for this, the consistency of the design across multiple villas indicates that this was not an isolated experiment. It was a localized architectural tradition. The origins of that tradition remain uncertain. Bulla Regia predates Roman control, having earlier Numidian phases, and it is possible that elements of subterranean construction reflect pre-Roman practices adapted and expanded under imperial influence. However, direct evidence linking the Hypogean villas to specific indigenous techniques is limited. No textual sources from the period describe the reasoning behind this architectural choice. Roman writers, who documented many aspects of domestic design, do not mention a comparable model in detail. As a result, the decision to build downward rather than upward remains only partially explained, supported by environmental logic but lacking a complete historical narrative. Comparison with other regions underscores the anomaly. Across the Roman Empire, domestic architecture follows recognizable patterns, an emphasis on facade, spatial sequence, and social visibility. Even in challenging climates, solutions tend to modify rather than reverse these principles. Bulla Regia does something different. It reduces visibility in favor of stability. It places comfort beneath display, and it does so repeatedly across a network of elite homes that were clearly aware of each other's design choices. The result is not a mystery in the sense of an unsolved enigma with no explanation. The physical mechanisms are understood, the environmental benefits are measurable, but the broader question remains open. Why did this solution emerge here, in this specific form? And why did it not spread more widely across regions that could have benefited from it just as much? Without written records to clarify intention, the answer must be reconstructed from material evidence alone. Bulla Regia demonstrates a form of architectural intelligence that operates quietly. There are no monumental facades or towering structures to announce its presence. Instead, its most sophisticated spaces are concealed, protected by the very ground that stabilizes them. What survives is not only a set of buildings, but a pattern of decisions practical, consistent, and locally adapted that challenge assumptions about how Roman architecture functioned. If the empire possessed